Stay groovy. Comment, like, share, subscribe.
In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the fantasy genre underwent a seismic shift that would forever change its course. Amid this backdrop, the Ballantine adult fantasy series was born. This publishing endeavor, which ran from 1969 to 1974, aimed at giving fantasy literature its due place alongside other respected genres. Spearheaded by editor Lynn Carter, the series focused on resurrecting and publishing forgotten classics of fantasy literature, as well as introducing new works and authors that would go on to define the genre.
Initiate Sequence Retrotron Entertainment presents
That 70s Nerd! Linwood Vrooman Carter, known as Lynn Carter, was a prolific science fiction and fantasy author born in 1930. He is best remembered for his work in the 1960s and 1970s, during which he helped popularize the sword and sorcery genre alongside figures like Robert E. Howard and Michael Moorcock. Prior to 1970, Carter had already achieved recognition in the sci-fi community by authoring numerous novels and anthologies, as well as for his editorial work in reviving interest in earlier fantasy literature. His original works included his Callisto and Thungor series. Carter was a man deeply passionate about fantasy literature and lore. He was not only concerned with publishing, but also aimed to educate readers about the history and taxonomy of fantasy. His contributions during this period helped lay the foundation for his enduring legacy in the broader realm of speculative fiction. One of his most important projects was shaping the Ballantine adult fantasy line. His introductions in the books often offered keen insights into the genre, its history, and its key figures. With the backing of Ballantine Books, Carter had the platform to curate a collection that would ultimately contribute to a wider acceptance and understanding of fantasy literature. The emblematic unicorns that adorn the spine and back cover of each book in the series are unforgettable to those who came across these editions. This distinctive logo, along with the standard format for titles, made the Ballantine adult fantasy books immediately recognizable. The design aimed to make a statement that these were not children's books, but works of literature meant for adult audiences interested in complex narratives, themes, and mythologies. The line commenced with The Blue Star by Fletcher Pratt, and what followed was a meticulously curated list that included both well-known classics and obscure gems. Works like William Morris's The Wood Beyond the World and Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter were reintroduced to a new generation. George MacDonald, a significant but often overlooked figure in fantasy literature, found his works like Phantastes and Lilith republished through the series. These publications were crucial in sustaining the legacies of these pioneering authors. Among the revitalized classics were also anthologies, such as Great Short Novels of Adult Fantasy Volumes 1 and 2, which included shorter works of fantasy that might otherwise be overlooked. While a majority of the titles were reprints, Lynn Carter also made room for new voices and visions in the series. Evangeline Walton's retelling of the Welsh Mabinogion, starting with The Island of the Mighty, was among the newer works that gained visibility through the series. Additionally, Carter himself contributed original works, such as The Wizard of Lemuria, to the lineup. In addition to novels and anthologies, the Ballantine adult fantasy series took an eclectic approach by also including collections of myth, folklore, and fairy tales, making it a comprehensive archive of fantasy literature in various forms. In all, the series published 65 titles, each chosen with a distinct purpose and vision that contributed to the broader tableau of what fantasy literature could be. While the Ballantine adult fantasy series was groundbreaking in many ways, it was not without its challenges. The publishing industry in the early 1970s was undergoing various transformations, including shifts in distribution methods and rising production costs. Additionally, the series was a niche market. Although it had a dedicated following, it didn't capture a broad audience, which was crucial for long-term viability. Lin Carter faced the inevitable constraints of balancing commercial viability with literary ambitions. Certain titles in the series did better than others, but consistent sales across the entire catalog were elusive. The series officially came to an end in 1974. Despite its relatively short lifespan, the impact it had on the fantasy genre was immense. Although Lin Carter continued his work in the field, contributing to anthologies and writing additional fantasy books, the Ballantine adult fantasy series remained a unique endeavor that couldn't be replicated in the same way. Betty Ballantine, who along with her husband Ian Ballantine, were the driving forces behind Ballantine Books, later reflected on the series as a bold but necessary venture that contributed significantly to the field of fantasy literature. The series gave a platform to many authors who had either been forgotten or were at risk of being relegated to obscurity. For instance, Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy was brought back to attention through the series. Similarly, E.R. Edison's The Worm Ouroboros, a high fantasy classic that predates even Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, was reintroduced, giving modern readers a chance to explore its complex narrative and ornate language. Another notable highlight was The Night Land by William Hope Hodgson, a classic that combined elements of horror and fantasy. Its inclusion in the Ballantine series rescued it from potential obscurity and opened up discussions on genre boundaries. Newer authors like Evangeline Walton, who reimagined Welsh myths, and Joy Chant with her Red Moon and Black Mountain, were given a stage to present fantasy literature that was not only entertaining but also deeply researched and culturally enriching. One of the less talked about but vital contributions of the series was the revival of fantasy subgenres that had fallen out of favor. For instance, sword and sorcery, a subgenre characterized by swashbuckling heroes and magical realms, was given new life through the works of authors like Robert E. Howard, whose Conan the Barbarian series was not part of the Ballantine line, but whose style was echoed in other selections. Additionally, the series delved into the realms of weird fiction, exemplified by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, and heroic fantasy. The revival of forgotten classics and neglected subgenres by the Ballantine adult fantasy series had a lasting influence on future generations of fantasy authors, acting almost like a bridge between the past masters and the new voices. By republishing works of authors like Lord Dunsany, William Morris, and E.R. Edison, the series exposed future writers to a range of styles and themes that they might not have encountered otherwise. This wider palette of influences enriched the genre, allowing it to evolve in more complex and interesting directions. For instance, the works of Lord Dunsany, one of the authors prominently featured in the Ballantine line, influenced the likes of Neil Gaiman. Gaiman has often spoken about his admiration for Dunsany's unique narrative style and imaginative scope. Similarly, William Morris's utopian fantasies paved the way for authors interested in blending social themes and fantastical elements, like Ursula K. Le Guin, who acknowledged the importance of earlier visionary works in shaping her own groundbreaking stories. Michael Moorcock, another giant in the fantasy field, has cited the influence of E.R. Edison's The Worm Ouroboros on his own Elric of Melniboné series. These newer authors not only acknowledged the influence of their predecessors, but also integrated elements of their styles, themes, and narrative techniques, thereby extending the lineage of fantasy literature into the contemporary era. In this way, the Ballantine adult fantasy series became more than just a collection of books. It became a crucial nexus in the intergenerational transmission of ideas and storytelling methods within the fantasy genre. In summarizing the Ballantine adult fantasy series, one cannot help but admire the effort that went into this ambitious project. Despite the challenges and its ultimate demise, the series served as an archive, a platform and a classroom for fantasy literature. It offered an assortment of treasures, from forgotten classics and literary experiments to mythological retellings that enrich the genre in ways that are still being felt today. The significance of the Ballantine adult fantasy series remains as a tribute to Lynn Carter's tireless ambition to elevate fantasy literature to new heights. Be sure to hit the bell for notifications so you never miss out on new videos or community posts.